Hello all, welcome to the channel. Today we're going to be looking at the many ways that the US population has, over the past several decades, increasingly taken up the behaviors and customs often seen in various types of cults, religious and otherwise. Though many influencers and public intellectuals have called attention to the ways that our major political parties increasingly resemble cults, that's just one small piece of the greater puzzle where the American social world as a whole has gradually turned more cultish, cult-like. A large part of the problem is that essentially no one who is in a cult sees themselves as being a cult member. Or in the words of Christopher Hitchens, the victim does the con man's work. But once you see the situation from the outside, it becomes tragic, bizarre, and heartbreaking. Now, it can be difficult to pinpoint exactly what constitutes a cult. As like the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche explained, any concept with a history becomes impossible to define, meaning that over time, concepts like feminism, liberalism, conservatism diversify, are malleable, and absorb new connotations as they continually span new borders and fields of study. It doesn't even take very long for definitions to become murky, like how so many who despise the concept of being woke can't seem to articulate what it means. That is to say, the lines of demarcation between what is and isn't a cult are fuzzy, and many social groups linger in the gray area. Some have likened the identification of cults to the identification of pornography, invoking Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart's "I know it when I see it." However, cults do share certain features and use certain time-tested strategies to gain varying levels of control over their members' behavior. Controlling those behaviors requires that cults institute a chain of command, and though many cults have incorporated democratic ideals like voting, they always form social structures that are hierarchical and top-down. So as controlling members' behavior becomes more paramount to the cult's sustainability, their social structures increasingly resemble those of monarchies, autocracies, and, not coincidentally, those of other great apes like chimps and gorillas, where a single ruler and their favored flunkies dominate group function. That single ruler justifies their superior rank by exhibiting ostensibly greater morals, intellectual capabilities, or depth of commitment to their group's goals, and consistently seek to exercise specific types of physical, mental, and social control over their underlings. In the realm of physical control, though many cults have restrictions on what their members are allowed to eat, other common tactics include restrictions on the clothes that they're allowed to wear or the hairstyles they're allowed to keep, often including facial hair. In the realm of social control, cults dictate which social relationships are acceptable to keep, isolating their members from outside influence. And just as seen in clans of chimps and gorillas, they also meddle in their sex lives, all too often leading to assaults, trauma, practices of eugenics, where cults try to manipulate who's allowed to procreate. Most importantly, in the realm of mental control, as George Orwell noted when illustrating Autocracy, cult leaders dictate the language that their members are allowed to use, often assigning them new vocabularies that only people within the group understand, or even banning certain words and entire languages in hopes of obliterating entire concepts and sometimes even entire cultures. Like cult leaders Jim Jones, David Koresh, or countless dictators, they're often long-winded and force their members to listen to them jabber interminably. Taking total mental control requires that cult leaders gain a certain amount of control over their members' very thoughts, and they do that by regulating the types of information that their members have access to, or by outlawing criticism and questioning of their leaders' tactics. Taking control to its apex, cult leaders ideally want their devotees to be fully dependent on them for all their needs, often portraying themselves as their sole source of protection. In return for their submission, cult members gain a sense of moral, intellectual, and social superiority over the outside world. They gain a sense of belonging and safety. They gain a motivating mission and a sense of purpose, quite often believing that the pain that they endure for the cult contributes to the greater good, and commonly lured by guarantees that their cult is the fulcrum vital to making a more functional, even utopian world. Cults also commonly offer their congregations access to immortality, literal or figurative, a particularly effective incentive for those fretting over their ever-looming demise. Where cults differ greatly is their size, with entire countries like North Korea forming a cult around a dynasty of dictators, but they can also be so small as single families. Family-sized cults have a long history, and of course they still center on controlling the actions and thoughts of group members, but their leaders come built in and have exclusive rights over if and how much of their power is distributed among kin, usually depending on the size of the family. When cults are the size of families, they control lower-ranked members, generally women and kids, by taking measures to ensure that they remain kids permanently. And some of the most typical examples come down from ancient Rome. A cultural and legal practice known as patria potestas. Under Roman law, the oldest male of each household, aka the pater familias, had dictatorial rule over all family members and any slaves that they might own. His progeny considered children by the Roman legal system until that man died. He controlled their property, finances, and religious practices, had the right to determine who his kids associated with, and to determine their marriages and divorces. Pater familias had the legal right to sell his own kids into slavery, banish them from the family, or even end their lives if he saw fit. Bolstering those traditions, most Roman women were legally considered children their entire lives. In modern times, those practices are still seen worldwide and become more likely as populations adhere to rigidly hierarchical top-down social structures like monarchies, oligarchies, autocracies, theocracies, and cults. With Roman culture having strongly influenced America's founding fathers, the US has had an abundance of cults since its very establishment, partly a product of the objective, universal morals that America was founded on, and struggled violently to institute that make religious freedom possible. With the nation's stock of cults having seen periodic influxes alongside America's perpetually evolving zeitgeist, one major example comes from the early 19th century, during America's intermittent Great Awakening movements, where groups splintered off from more widely standardized practices of Christianity, forming factions like the Mormons, Millerites, Shakers, or the Oneida Commune. Not coincidentally, and demonstrating how populations more closely resemble cults as they become more hierarchical, at the same time, American slave owners referred to, thought of, and belittled their adult slaves as children. Alternatively, other groups like the pseudo-cult Freemasons were more secular and counted 17 US presidents among their ranks, including Washington. In the last half of the 20th century, the US saw another major influx of cults, with the rise of groups like the Manson family, Unification Church, Children of God, Jonestown, Branch Davidians, and Heaven's Gate, or on a larger scale with Scientology and the enormous success of Mormonism. On a national scale, as the American social world has become more hierarchical and top-down like never before since the turn of the 21st century, driving the largest transfer of wealth in human history, the practices known to the family-sized cults of ancient Rome have suffused the entire country, where at one time thinkers like the French aristocrat Alexis de Tocqueville claimed that Europe's adults suffered from a prolonged adolescence, while American adults weren't subject to the same problem. But that's no longer the case. To put this in perspective, it's no coincidence that it's now widely acceptable for adults to have toy collections, or spend copious amounts of time playing tabletop games, board games, or video games, to watch cartoons, anime, have coloring books, and exclusively read fiction, or far more likely, and like pre-literate children, not read at all. It's no coincidence that it's become the norm for adults to dress up for Halloween, or sporting events, or cosplay, or to don furry costumes. It's no coincidence that so many full-grown adults own nothing more substantial than their car, often not even that, as more get by without ever attaining a license, and that more adults are living with their parents. It's no coincidence that the US economy that was once based on manufacturing has now transitioned to service jobs, where Americans depend on others to drive them around, teach them, tend to their health, and most importantly, cater to their hunger, with one of the primary signs of reaching adulthood being able to procure and prepare your own food. It's no coincidence that American adults have subscriptions to to breakfast cereal services, drink sugary alcohol, or have intense relationships with imaginary AI friends. It's no coincidence that the US prison population has exploded in recent decades, with millions of Americans relegated to the adult version of the timeout corner. It's no coincidence that more adults aren't having children or have given up on intimacy entirely. Tens of millions spend their adulthood attempting to recreate their childhood and throw professional temper tantrums when the colossal nostalgia industries that coddle them don't recreate that childhood to their exact specifications. Countless subsections of the American social world have also taken up more traditional themes of cultism, often practicing their own lexicons that are opaque to outside observers and keeping unique sets of holy men, holy texts, and their own prophecies. On the more anodyne side of the scale, you have groups often referred to as benign cults, often built around sports teams or businesses that control people's behavior in a more minimalistic way, like Disney that recreates childhoods and milks nostalgia for all it's worth, or Apple where many adherents still sport their products to gain a sense of social superiority and worship Steve Jobs as a demigod. A step beyond benign cults, you have influencer and fandom cults constructed around cultural icons like entertainers, entrepreneurs, and political figures, where members compete to display the deepest devotion, and perhaps seen best in the fiercely defensive Swiftie, Musk disciples, or Trump supporters. Others instead turn to exercise cults like yoga and CrossFit clans that too have their own languages, liturgy, literature, and celebrity leaders, and are significantly more invasive when it comes to controlling the thoughts and behaviors of their group members. Sometimes connected with exercise cults, there's also the larger social sect known as the Manosphere that specifically targets young men, tells them that they are and how to be socially, morally, and intellectually superior, tells them to only trust the word of men like Rogan, Peterson, or Tate, and that adopting their perspectives will improve their lives and consequently improve the world. Often connected with the Manosphere, the rise of internet culture over the past 2 decades has played a large role in the cultification of America and bred socially caustic groups like the incel community, crypto cults, and conspiracy theory networks like QAnon that entices by promising members that they will generate an American utopia. Often connected with those groups, internet culture has empowered an ever-splintering assortment of often militant political cults that seek to control the behaviors of everyone, whether they're part of the cult or not, bringing outlandish conspiracy theories into the mainstream and installing their misguided devotees to school boards, city councils, and Congress. They commonly claim social, intellectual, and moral superiority over those who aren't in that cult, but that desperate need to feel elevated over others infects cults internally too, and contributes to their inevitable splintering. A relatively minor example seen in the labeling of some Republicans as rhinos, and to the supreme misfortune of all, dinos have yet to make an appearance. More prevalent in some states than others, political cults tend to be utopian, attribute their leaders godlike significance, and greatly contribute to the infantilization of adults. Taking part themselves, the politicians that lead their movements increasingly emulate the behaviors of children, having juvenile and emotionally charged interactions with the media in some instances, other times playing dress-up, with figures like Kristi Noem or Vivek Ramaswamy donning different costumes depending on their audience, or Pete Hegseth's pantsuits and makeup studio. Those same politicians treat their constituents like children, regularly ignoring or vetoing the will of voters, or preventing them from accessing certain types of information by refusing to release certain files. Not so different from ancient Rome's paterfamilia, political cults are often strongly concerned with the rights of parents to control their children and prevent any influence from outside. That's conveniently contributed to problems in the US education system that cults have been waging war on for decades now, vilifying educators of all variety and portraying them as part of a deep state conspiracy. Their attacks on the US education system are related to the control of information that's so necessary to sustaining cults, and has gone on full display in the media slash business empire slash dynasty of Larry Ellison, Rupert Murdoch, Bezos, Zuckerberg, and Elon Musk, billionaires dictating the type and extent of information that's acceptable for the US population to see, and Musk specifically depicted by his diehard disciples as a hyper-intelligent superhuman, despite ever-expanding evidence to the contrary. Perhaps best seen in his having adopted the tenets of the thoroughly debunked pseudoscience of eugenics that's unfortunately seeped into the rotting, increasingly cult-like American milieu. That facade of information dominance is also seen in mantras like Trump was right about everything, and in accusations of Trump derangement syndrome as it becomes anathema to question or criticize the cult leader. Advertising their adults as children perspective, it's no coincidence that Vance discarded the repulsive leaked text message chain of the Young Republicans as the behavior of kids, or that Tucker Carlson famously gave an obscene depiction of Trump as a wrathful father. It's no coincidence that the architects of America are referred to as our founding fathers, that many Trump supporters call him daddy, or that America is widely ridiculed as a nation with daddy issues. It's no coincidence that Trump too has been crowned with godlike status, many of his devotees attributing him responsibility for performing outright miracles, or Mike Pence and several others who explicitly likened serving Trump with serving God. On the other side of the coin, as populations turn more top-down and culty, they have an unspeakably revolting tendency to make kids into adults, exposing them to kid-friendly forms of gambling in their video games, parading them around in beauty pageants, dissolving child labor laws, and other far more ghoulish forms of child abuse. Just like other top-down societies like monarchies and autocracies, cults run on cash. More traditional forms of cults often require that members donate their savings or give up control of their personal possessions, very effective ways to make people dependent and gain significant control over their behavior. Many cults go a step further and use their members for slave labor. As one student of cultism explained upon seeing their groups proliferate in the 70s, there's nothing religious about these cults. It's a multi-million-dollar con game. Now it's become a multi-billion-dollar con game, and as the characteristics of cults have gone mainstream, many such groups have given up the pretense of religion entirely, though political cults still do often use religion to commandeer a sense of moral superiority, but in practice are divorced from their original values entirely. Instead, we now have a national cult whose only god is money. As author Kurt Vonnegut wrote, the most beautiful thing money could buy was a childhood a lifetime long, and as American culture has shifted towards oligarchy, autocracy, and cultism, we formed a national gerontocracy where older generations are devouring their offspring, while simultaneously perpetually voicing deep concern over providing a better world for future generations. Pointed to by one-time presidential candidate Nikki Haley, who called Congress the nation's most privileged nursing home, we've seen the average age of Congress and presidents steadily increase, but it takes place on a much larger scale too, where nationwide state pension programs are causing tremendous budget problems and cannibalizing funds desperately needed elsewhere. Of quite similar effect, the compensation packages of the nation's CEOs has been skyrocketing since the late 80s, while their workers increasingly depend on taxpayer-funded welfare programs. The nation's aged citizens are eating the youth alive, and preventing younger generations from accumulating capital is a supremely effective way of making them dependent, ensuring a constant source of labor, and quite closely emulates the practices of cults. Though US life expectancy is declining, those are the same people who can afford to pay for healthcare and are accordingly living significantly longer. A generation that largely had education and housing handed to them has has been gaslighting their more youthful cult initiates by berating them for not working hard enough. That's led to a generation that can't afford to have children, with America consequently and largely unintentionally practicing eugenics as a result. Mirroring monarchies, autocracies, and cults in other ways too, anti-American practices of nepotism have become the norm, alongside family dynasties in the ever-merging worlds of politics and business, seeing the same names run the country for generations. It's no coincidence that we're hearing business tycoons and world leaders like Putin and Xi discuss their adolescent dreams of immortality, financing sometimes revolting medical experiments in the quest to achieve it. Some have compared the nation to a massive pyramid scheme, and it's no coincidence that the substrate of the American social world has become such fertile soil for cultivating prolific scammers and grifters, with morally bankrupt tycoon grifters like Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, or Zuckerberg acting as the West's new itinerant evangelists. Those same figures are burning billions on underground bunkers and guarded compounds to prepare for when the world they've played such a large part in obliterating begins to threaten their safety. They've purchased massive tracts of land intended for assembling fake utopian cities, invested in seasteading, and verbally defecate dreams of building futuristic space colonies where they can preside over far more traditional forms of cults. Though many Americans love ogling the bizarre standards and behaviors that national cults like North Korea accept as normal, it's not so different from what's happening here. The problem with being brainwashed is that it's impossible to tell. You're living in a box that's built to be opaque, and it can be difficult to even imagine that there's any world outside of it. Americans are indoctrinated from birth to believe that this is the only way that life can be, so it's best to fall in line and get used to it. Not so different from longtime drug users who trade their habit for religion or politics. Ex-cult members have a suspiciously consistent tendency of finding themselves joining new cults, and such behaviors stem from basic human needs like a sense of belonging, an unfortunately common need to feel superior, and a much more legitimate need to feel as though we're improving the world around us. A core impetus for this channel is to deprogram viewers in a world where brainwashing and cultism has become the norm, and the fastest, most reliable way to do that is to study history and human nature, but I'll try to pick out some of the highlights in coming videos.